So what did you think? I'd like to bring our guest speakers up, please. Mr. Leo Ullman, I introduced you at the beginning. If you would please join us here. Mr. Ullman, formerly the chairman and CEO of Cedar Realty Trust, Inc., survived the Holocaust as a hidden child in Amsterdam while his parents were hidden elsewhere. Please take a seat. And I would like to ask Latifah Woodhouse, will you join us, please? To remind you, Latifah Woodhouse is a human rights and women's rights activist, and she's the first and only Fulbright Scholar awarded to a student who is from Kandahar, Afghanistan. Latifah, please have a seat. And Colin Woodhouse, if you would join us, please, is a member of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Shelter Rock and a chair of the Socially Responsible Subcommittee. Okay, I want to thank you all for being with us. I think that first what we'll do is we'll get your impressions. I know my mother's here, and she's a survivor of the Holocaust. Are there any others here who have a connection to this history? Yeah. Yes, there are. Leo, we're going to share the mic. You will share.
Sure.
Okay. I think you're used to that. Yeah. So, if we could start, Leo, with your impressions of this film.
I thought it was a very good film, and I think the focus on rescuing Jewish people is extraordinary. I think these people were extremely lucky because they were able to get out of Germany early. And France was not as brutalized as other countries in Europe.
Can
so
you hear
they were able
him?
to survive.
Yeah.
I think it was an extraordinary effort by Americans because, in general, America did close its borders, did not let very many refugees in. Indeed, neither did England or many other countries. So it's an extraordinary success story for those people who did survive.
And I hope those of you who were watching carefully noticed that there was a brief reference when they were in Prague to Nicholas Winton,
Yeah.
who recently passed away at the age of, I think, 105, right? And he was knighted by the Queen. He became Sir Nicholas because of the work that he did and quietly, and kept it quiet. Another one of those untold stories, kept it quiet for 55 years. So that was also something that was meaningful in the course of this narrative. How did you get here, Leo?
Well, we survived during the war and tried to get out when the Germans bombed Holland on May 10th, 1940. We went to the port of IJmuiden, and my parents and my grandmother and I was at that point 6 months old. Holland had been guaranteed not to be attacked by Hitler because Holland was neutral in World War I. Notwithstanding that, they bombed Rotterdam to smithereens, and some of us tried to escape. Many members of my family were able to buy passage on small fishing boats and get to London and ultimately to Canada and the US. My mother's sister and her family, in fact, escaped, and my mother's sister was one of the founders of the community synagogue in Port Washington. My parents and I arrived at this fishing port, and it was utter chaos. So my grandmother had an earache, and I had a toothache, or vice versa. And we decided that we would try to leave on another day. Of course, a few days thereafter, the border was sealed, and we never did get out. Long story short, we did survive during the war, very difficult circumstances, separated from my parents. And like the kids here, I was placed with somebody who took care of me, loved me, let me survive. My parents also survived, although their situation was much different because they paid for their hiding place, and when the money and the food ran out, it became very, very difficult. I didn't knowingly suffer. At the end of the war, my parents came to pick me up, and I didn't know them. I had been living at that point for 2.5 years with another mother and another father who I thought were my parents. And suddenly these very gaunt-looking people whom I didn't know came to get me. My father had feet that were just extremely large because they had edemas from not walking during the entire war. They were hidden in an attic in Amsterdam with no knowledge where I was or whether I was alive. And the people who hid me had no idea who I was or where I came from. But suddenly they arrived at the door, and my war parents knew immediately who they were and why they came. And so at that point, I went with them to their hiding place. And in the hiding place, they had saved a can of baked beans for the day when their son would come back. They had been subject to abject starvation, but notwithstanding that, they saved this can of beans. And when I came to their hiding place, they opened this can of beans with great ceremony. And I said, "Ugh, I don't like baked beans." Oh, well.
So much for tender reunions.
Right. But in terms of getting here, at that point, when the war was over and shortly thereafter, my father got his job back at the large Dutch department store where he'd worked. My father was an immigrant from Germany who left in 1932. And they were able to get a house in Amsterdam. And my father had a job. He had a nice little car. You would think everything would be fine. And at that point, after the war, the Russians had taken over Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, all the Balkan countries and the Baltic countries. They were just 200 kilometers from Amsterdam. And my parents thought that they didn't want to live under the risk of occupation by a foreign power yet again. So they wanted to come to America at that point. And we came in 1947. It was December 8th. And we arrived in Port Washington, and we've lived there ever since, from 1947 to today. My parents took me to the local Main Street school, and I'll just end with this. And I didn't speak to a word of English. And my mother said to the principal at that time, Miss Merriman, after whom the school was named and so forth later, said, "What's going to happen to my boy? He doesn't speak a word of English." And before Essel and Tessel, Miss Merriman said, "Well, for the first couple of weeks, the other kids will beat him up, but after that, it'll be fine." And I think that's what happened.
I can testify to that from personal experience. Colin and Latifa. Artemis Joukowsky, the director of this film, is also the grandson of Martha and Waitzel. What inspired him to make this film?
You know, we became very friendly with Artemis in 2006. As he was at a celebration of the awarding of his grandparents as righteous among nations. And the celebration was also part of our Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, which is our human rights organization, which is built on the foundations of what the Sharps did in World War II. And what we found so interesting was with Artemis, it was a school project. It simply started as, why don't you talk to your grandmother? He had to do a project on honor and moral courage. And his mother said, "Well, why don't you talk to your grandmother? I think she's done something like that. You might be interested." And the family knew nothing. He knew nothing of what they had done, and that was the way it was. I found that so interesting in our, you know, the World War II generation. The stories were buried in so many ways, and people tried to move on with their lives. But Artemis was able to dig up this information, at first with cassettes, and then with going in, and after his grandmother had died, finding about 200,000 documents all buried in their cellar, not buried, but put away in their cellar. And that, he said, at the very beginning, he knew it was a story that had to be told. And I asked him, when did you get that? He said he knew it right away. It was just getting the tools and getting the time and the information to make it happen.
So let me ask you this. Ken Burns is obviously a very well-known and a very highly respected documentarian. And I don't think I need to mention that getting Tom Hanks to do the voiceover is quite an amazing thing. He's currently starring in Bridge of Spies, which, by the way, is very good. Here. How did that come about? Do you know?
Well, yeah, Artemis had sent an early iteration of the film to Ken Burns. Ken Burns and Artemis are college mates from Hampshire College. And
no coincidences.
No coincidence. And Tom Hanks is famous, and Artemis sent one of his first iterations of the film to him, and Ken Burns said, well, it's a nice film. It's nice. And then Artemis kept working on it for many years thereafter, and then he sent it to him again. And this is one man who's not, like his grandmother, he's dogged, and he's persistent, and he's got the right message. And he sent it back to Tom Hanks, and he said, this is a masterpiece. I want to be involved. And he wanted to, Ken Burns made it more of a personal story, and he wanted to pull out what had happened to the parents and to the family, where Artemis had made it more of a story of triumph over evil to some degree, and over the system. And it was, the family was reticent to get their personal information out, especially his mother, who's a college professor at Brown's emeritus. So it took a while to bring up that hurt and have the family expose it in public and acknowledge it. And just one last note, at the celebration of Yad Vashem, Martha Jr. was at that celebration, and someone came up to her and said, I want to thank you for what you did. And she said, what do you mean? I was a kid. What did I know? And they said, had your parents not felt that they could leave you and that you would be all right, I wouldn't be here today. And I want to thank you for the gift that you gave us of life.
And of course, that was the time that Martha told us, this is a first-hand story, that then she thought, okay, even though she was upset with her parents and she did not like what they did and she felt deprived of, being the childhood that she should have had, but that turned the light bulb on in her head. Yes, I am part of this work. And if my parents wouldn't have left me, they wouldn't be able to save the lives of so many Jewish children from the atrocity of the Nazi war. So.
What impact did Martha's and her husband's work, but you're involved in women's rights and so on. What impact did she have on your community?
Well, a great impact. First of all, because of them, our Unitarian Universalist Service Committee started during that time. That's before our denomination, the Unitarian Universalist, started. And our chalice, from what I have learned, comes from where, when they were in Czechoslovakia and France, they would have safe houses for the Jewish people and would have the light, the candle, and people could run and go into those houses. And that's what we do. Every Sunday on our service, we light the chalice, and that symbol comes from there. And it has had an incredible, I want to say to all of you, I'm proud to be a Unitarian Universalist because of the good work that the Sharps has done in many other UUs in the principle that we believe in, Although I grew up Muslim from Kandahar, Afghanistan, as you said it, but to join this religion of the UUs and to be part of it, it gives me a personal pride and personal joy. And I've been a member of the congregation for 20 years, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Shelter Rock. And I have, of course, joined forces with Artemis and his mother and brother and you know, all the family because of the great work that Martha and Waistel Sharp, who was our UU minister, did. And every time I see this film, it creates incredible emotion inside me that I cannot describe, that as human, we could do so much good. And it's all about love and justice. You know, if we could bring that love and justice, we will have a peaceful world for all, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of ethnicity, of who we are. And as she said, when they came back to America, you know, the baseball, the football, the children are playing, but I know that firsthand, coming from Afghanistan, what people in the other part of the world goes through. So you could all, that's our purpose through this movie. You know, I am Artemis's partner in the movie in terms of what we want to create, not only what they did, the great work that they did, but I call on all of you to stand in the shoes of the Sharps and do the good work for humanity, because we're all human. We can all connect at that level.
Okay.
You know, thank you. I just want to, I called Artemis before this gathering, and I said, Artemis, what am I going to tell these people? You know, you're not there. And he said, just tell them I love them. And he said, also tell them that when this is shown in the fall of 2016, bring your neighbors, bring people together, and do the good work and bring love to the world. And that's what he's known for. He loves love, and he loves people. And this has been a labor of love for him for over a decade to tell this story. And as Unitarians, with our colleagues there, our hope, our congregation has contributed $100,000 to promote this film for interfaith gatherings, so that it can, hopefully the message can pull people together, and together we can turn in the direction of peace, love, justice, and hope for our community, our families, and for all of mankind.
Well, we're going to take questions from the audience on such a noble ending here. We start with Karen.
So since when you started, you said how relevant this is to today, and I'm thinking that our three guests can give us a perspective on how they feel the migratory crisis today, and also in connection with the film. When you show the film, do you think it would sensitize people more to the crisis that's going on today?
Great question, Karen. I have been thinking about that, and Artemis and I have been talking about that in terms of today. It's very, very relevant, more than ever, of what's happening in Europe, and you see it with your own eyes with the Syrian refugees, Iraqi refugees, Afghan refugees, in the lines, in the child being brought up in the waves of the water. So yes, that is the rescue mission that the Sharp went and left their two little children and took that risk on themselves and saved those many lives and produced wonderful survivors. It's a pleasure and honor to meet you, but I have met a lot of survivors, the ones that are in the film. Some have passed away and some are still alive, through Artemis's connection, and the stories in how they now have lives and children in, you know, they are American citizens or British citizens in productive life they're leading. So when we save that humanity from that atrocity, we're giving treasure and gold to the world, and how wonderful that is. Once again, I would like to say that I'm proud of my congregation that they just passed a large grant, crisis grant for the Syrian refugee just recently. Our executive director, the Reverend Ned White, is right there, and our Reverend Natalie Fenimore is there with her husband. So, you know, the congregation we're being blessed by a great endowment of Carolina Beach, But because of that, we have great people and great principles to really reach out, not only in the United States, but to the world to help. So with
I think the question really was, and let me just interrupt you
Sure.
for a moment. If I'm not mistaken, the parallels. Yeah, are there parallels, and what are the parallels, and what are the differences? And maybe I'll see just for a moment if you have any thoughts on that, Leo.
I do. I think the parallels are absolutely clear. What has happened is that there are, at this point, millions of displaced people, which is much more than we actually faced in World War II, at least in Europe. But the borders have been closed effectively, or are being closed. We in the U.S. have given lip service to perhaps taking from 10 to 65,000 maximum persons, which is just a pimple on an elephant's rear end. It's just insignificant. Other borders have been closed, including England. And Germany has now started to close its borders because of overwhelming influx of refugees. I think the parallels are significant in that the reactions are quite brutal ultimately, even though millions have already reached Europe. I think they're not going to come here, and they're not going to get to England very easily.
And the differences?
That's a tough one. You know, I'm just thinking the similarities are fear, demonizing people different from us who come from different societies, yet have all the treasures that they offer as human beings to their host society that they're moving to. So, you know, I think the difference is that there are people out there trying to save lives, more so perhaps than during World War II. Although I can't say that for sure, but people are trying to get these folks from Syria across the Mediterranean, trying to bring them through Europe. But how far they can go, it's still uncertain. The destinations, I don't see much difference. There are closed borders. There's people who are fearful, who push these folks along because they don't want them living in their country and don't realize what they could do for them and together. But I can't really say that. I'd like to know what the audience feels.
Yeah, okay. Here's somebody over here, and I'll come back to
Can
you.
I just add one
got the
little
mic.
wrinkle? I think the other part of this is the obverse of the refugee situation, and that is the parallel of ISIS to Nazism. And there have been very powerful items written on this, one by Steve Luckert of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, which draw these analyses very carefully and focus on propaganda and the role of killing to create fear, et cetera, et cetera. The parallels are clear.
We have a comment or a question over here.
I can hold it. I'll hold your hand.
No, you may.
I have two questions for Mr. Ullman. First question, if you were general manager of a baseball team and you had the ability to pick any players on your pitching staff, would you choose Sandy Koufax or Nolan Ryan? Leo knows what I'm talking about. I'm just being a little cute there.
I, of course,
It's
am
obviously an
very,
in-joke, but okay. Okay. Well,
I am
let's
very
t-
partial to Nolan Ryan because he pitched for 23 years. He left the Mets in exchange for a third baseman who played for 1 year. Sandy Koufax only pitched for 6 years, and I'm partial. But I think you had a serious question.
I have a serious question. Leo, you might know her. Do you have any idea how many Jews were hidden during World War II and saved?
I only know the Dutch story, I'm sad to say. The Dutch story was a very difficult one because the Jews were more effectively eliminated in Holland than any other country of Western Europe. There were 140,000 Jewish persons in Holland before the war. After the war, 14,500. 107,000 were deported to concentration camps. Only 4,000 came back. It's estimated that 16 to 20,000 people went into hiding in Holland, and that of those in hiding, perhaps 12,000, many of them children like myself, did survive.
We have a comment back here, a question?
Thank you. This is a comment going along with the previous question about the numbers of refugees and taking refugees in by the different countries and the closed borders. I think there are parallels, but I think if we ignore the differences, we are fooling ourselves. The differences now, one big difference is that we're worried that there are terrorists among the refugees, and to ignore that is to fool ourselves, and to not say it out loud is to lie to ourselves in every country. Nobody is being demonized, but this is a new state of civilization we're in, and we need to vet them. I don't think I knew that word 10 years ago or used it in connection to people and refugees and ethnicities, but all of a sudden it's a word that we cannot overlook, and is not demonizing anybody. It's just to deal with our new reality.
That's a difference. We've got a question back here. You have to say the same thing? Okay. That's okay, we don't need similar.
Okay, that's all right. I'd like to offer a different perspective than the woman that just spoke. I think what's different is that there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear of refugees. There's a lot of fear of terrorism. Some of the facts that people don't know are that most of the refugees are Muslim. Most of the people who are suffering are innocent, are Muslim. Many of our reactions to the horrors of France in the last few days were not even, most of the people probably in this audience don't even know that the day before in Beirut there was a very, very similar tragedy. And I think what happens is that we have demonized Muslims as the other and as always potential for terrorism, but we have not seen the common humanity that most of them, 99.999% of them, are victims, and we really need to reach out to them.
That's good.
Sorry? I know, but I have to terminate the conversation. Excuse me. I'm terribly sorry, but we're not having this conversation right now. We can talk about baseball again if you like.
Yeah, exactly.
But right now, I am so not, I apologize if you feel that I'm slighting you, but we unfortunately have a, okay, we're not, it is 6:30, and I'm going to take advantage of my position. I have an award ceremony. Latifah and Colin
Yeah.
Woodhouse.
He wants to hear from me. Can I answer?
You can hear from in 1 second. I just want you to understand that I am now a half an hour late for our own award ceremony, and I need to get to it. So I would suggest that if you could wrap it up with your last comment, and
Sure.
then if you want to come forward and have a conversation, we are welcoming you to come
Sure.
forward. We just have a schedule with what's going on tonight. We have to tabulate those awards, as mundane as that.
Yeah. Do you
So-
have a question for me, or do you want me to? Oh, I 100% agree with you, and thank you for mentioning that, because that is the situation. You're absolutely right. To this gentleman's point, yes, we have rejoiced the good life here, but there is, since September 11, that's obvious. That's not something that he's making up. There is a lot of demonization towards Muslim in the United States of America, and that's unfortunate. We can't do that to humanity. Regardless of what religion you are, we're all human. We all want to be accepted and loved and appreciated for what we bring to the society and to the community. So yes, there is, and we can't deny the fact.
And on that note, I'm going to say, let us thank our guests for being here and appreciate it very, very much. You are.
That's good.
I did not want to start World War III here in my theater.